In towns and villages across Africa, you will find everyday people, small farmers pushing cracked soil between their fingers, young students walking miles to reach a dimly lit classroom, mothers carrying water barrels through the heat of the day. These are not just scenes of struggle, they are scenes of a continent waiting for the world to finally listen. And last week, inside a crowded hall in Ekurhuleni, South Africa, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in a generation, Africa did not whisper. Africa spoke with a voice so clear, so unapologetic, that even the most powerful nations paused to hear it. As the lights dimmed inside the G20 Social Summit, you could feel a shift in the air. Not fear, not celebration, but something deeper awakening. A continent that holds 30% of the world's minerals, 60% of its arable land, and the youngest population on Earth finally stood up and said, "We will no longer be observers of our own destiny." It was not the language of diplomacy. It was the language of a people tired of carrying the weight of decisions made in rooms where they have no seat. Decisions about their land, their resources, their future. And this raises a question for you watching from across the ocean. If a continent so vital to the world's prosperity has been kept at the margins for so long, what does that say about the global order we've trusted for decades? And more importantly, what happens when Africa demands its rightful place at the table? This moment matters not only for Africans, but for Americans, Europeans, and everyone who believes the world should be fairer, more stable, and more honest. And as leaders from South Africa, the African Union, and rising figures like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso inspire a new wave of sovereignty across the continent, the global balance begins to shift. Before we go deeper, I invite you stay with me until the end. If you care about truth, justice, and the future of African news and global leadership, this is a story you cannot miss. Across rural Africa, the morning begins with the same quiet struggle. A farmer wakes before sunrise, scanning a sky that offers no promise of rain. A young man tightens the laces on worn-out shoes as he prepares for another day searching for work. A grandmother stirs a pot over an open fire, wondering whether the meal will last until nightfall. These simple human moments are often ignored in international halls of power. But at the G20 Social Summit in Ekurhuleni, those voices once distant arrived in the room with unmistakable force. The event began like many global summits do: suits, flags, formal greetings. But the tone shifted the moment Africa's representatives took the podium. Instead of opening with statistics or polite acknowledgments, the speaker addressed the world with a direct truth: Africa has been living under a global system built without Africa. It wasn't a complaint. It was a revelation that demanded attention. It immediately reframed the summit not as a diplomatic exercise, but as a historic reckoning. The speaker reminded the room that Africa's exclusion was not accidental. The major global institutions guiding economics, trade, and development were created in an era when Africans had no political voice, no negotiating power, and in many cases, no freedom. Entire frameworks, the IMF, the World Bank, the early structures of global climate policy were formed without the continent's participation. These structures now shape, restrict, and assess Africa's development, even though Africa never consented to their rules. And then came the numbers delivered slowly, intentionally, like the striking of a drum: 30% of the world's mineral reserves, 60% of the world's arable land, the youngest population on Earth, less than 4% of global emissions but the hardest hit by climate disasters. Not shouted, not dramatized, simply spoken as facts that could no longer be ignored. The room shifted again. Delegates leaned forward. Journalists stopped typing. The world for once was forced to see Africa not as a place of crisis, but as the backbone of the 21st century. The speaker pointed out another painful truth: despite being the source of the minerals that power smartphones, electric cars, batteries, satellites, and the digital revolution, Africa is still treated as a customer, never as a creator. The continent that fuels the world's progress is too often reduced to a marketplace for finished goods. This inequity, the speaker said, is not sustainable. It cannot continue without consequences for global stability. But perhaps the most powerful part of the event came when the speaker declared that Africa was not demanding charity, not pity, not development assistance packages. What Africa demanded was justice, the right to participate fully in shaping the global system that determines the fate of its people. For decades, decisions about African land, African minerals, African debt, and African futures were made in capitals thousands of miles away. Today, that era is ending. The speaker then introduced a crucial argument. Governments alone cannot transform the global order. True change requires the involvement of civil society, the people who live with the consequences of policy every day. Civil society brings the reality that formal institutions often lack. When the G20 debates food security, civil society brings the voice of a farmer who lost his harvest to drought. When digital transformation is on the agenda, they bring stories from communities where children still study by candlelight. When social protection is discussed, they speak for workers without contracts, insurance, or safety nets. This, the speaker insisted, is why Africa's place in the G20 is not a favor, but a necessity. A global order without Africa's full participation is incomplete and fundamentally flawed. The summit is not a symbolic gesture. It is the first step in rewriting the world's political and economic architecture with Africa as a co-author. And in this new architecture, leaders across the continent, from South Africa to the Sahel, from economic reformers to sovereignist figures like those rising in Burkina Faso, represent a growing movement asserting Africa's right to define its own future. For many following Africa news around the world, this summit marks the moment the continent stopped waiting for permission. At dawn, across the continent, another scene unfolds: children walking to school with bare feet on dusty roads, their laughter echoing against old concrete walls. They do not know about summit halls or global declarations, but they live the consequences of every policy shaped thousands of miles away. It is their future that hung in the balance when the moment of true confrontation arrived at the G20 Social Summit. Inside the vast hall in Ekurhuleni, the atmosphere tightened as the speaker paused mid-sentence. Delegates shifted in their chairs. Cameras tilted upward. Something was coming, something more forceful than polite diplomacy. And then, in a voice sharpened by decades of frustration and centuries of exclusion, the speaker delivered the line that cracked the room open: Africa will no longer be the subject of global policy. We will be the authors of it. It was the turning point, the moment when the summit stopped being an event and became a declaration of emancipation. The words did not merely challenge the world, they challenged history itself. No metaphors, no softening. Just truth delivered with the weight of an entire continent behind it. For a heartbeat, the room fell silent. Then, a wave of reactions, visible, layered humans, swept across the hall. African delegates nodded, some smiling gently, others gripping their notes as if the decades of waiting had finally found release. Younger representatives, especially those from civil society, leaned forward with the quiet electricity of recognition. This is what we came for. On the opposite side of the hall, the reactions were more controlled. Western diplomats maintained calm expressions, but their eyes revealed calculation. They knew that once Africa speaks in unity, whether in trade minerals, debt, or digital technologies, the balance of global power begins to tilt. A few exchanged glances, as if silently acknowledging that the era of a passive Africa was gone. Then came the next blow, delivered not in anger, but in a measured, undeniable truth. Africa's participation is not a favor. It is a requirement for the legitimacy of the global order. It was not shouted. It didn't need to be. The sheer clarity of the statement struck deeper than any dramatic gesture. In a single line, it exposed the fragility of old institutions and the rising expectation of a multipolar world. Civil society representatives erupted into applause, not loud or chaotic, but steady, deliberate, the kind that carries purpose. They were the heartbeat of this summit, and the speaker honored them directly. When food security is debated, they bring the voice of the farmer. When digital transformation is discussed, they bring the child with no internet. When social protection is on the agenda, they bring the worker with no safety net. This acknowledgement ignited a new emotional current in the hall. For once, those who live closest to the pain of inequality were not spectators, they were central to the conversation. South African ministers sitting in the front rows exchanged approval. Their nation had positioned itself as a continental messenger, and here the message was landing with force. The philosophy of Ubuntu and Am, because you are, was no longer cultural sentiment, it was a political statement about shared destiny. The summit's youth representatives reacted with particular intensity. Many of them had grown up in environments where global rules felt distant and unfair. Hearing a public declaration that Africa's future would be written by African hands triggered raw, hopeful emotion. For the first time, they saw themselves not as inheritors of a broken system, but as designers of a new one. International observers, particularly from Asia and Latin America, responded with nods of solidarity. They recognized the tone. It was the language of rising nations demanding dignity, language they themselves had used years ago. Meanwhile, journalists scribbled fast notes. They understood that this was the line that would dominate global headlines. Not because it was confrontational, but because it was finally undeniable. And for millions watching from home, from Dakar to Kampala, from Nairobi to Burkina Faso, this moment became a spark. On Africa news platforms, commentators immediately connected it to the growing spirit of sovereignty spreading across the continent, visible in leaders like those rising in Burkina Faso and beyond. This was the summit's heartbeat moment, the instant when Africa no longer asked to be heard, but insisted on being recognized. Long before the speeches and the applause, the first people to feel the weight of global decisions were those far from the cameras. A mother in rural Malawi trying to stretch a small bag of maize for a week. A fisherman on the coast of Senegal returning home with fewer catches because foreign fleets dominate the waters. A market vendor in Zambia adjusting prices as inflation erodes the value of every coin in her pocket. These quiet struggles form the backdrop to the political storm gathering around Africa's changing place in the world. When Africa stood at the G20 Social Summit and declared its intent to become an author of global policy, the consequences rippled outward instantly, reaching communities where development is not an abstract debate, but the difference between survival and hardship. Politically, the declaration signaled the beginning of a new era. African governments, long accustomed to reacting to frameworks designed elsewhere, are now confronted with a moment of self-definition. They can no longer remain passive or fragmented. The summit created an expectation, a moral and political obligation, that leaders must align national policies with a continental vision of sovereignty and justice. Failure to do so will expose them not to foreign criticism, but to their own citizens who now see that change is possible when Africa speaks with a united voice. For civil society, the consequences were even more immediate. Organizations representing farmers, teachers, nurses, small traders, youth groups, and digital activists found themselves elevated from stakeholders to co-authors. Their testimonies, once treated as peripheral, are now recognized as essential moral instruments guiding Africa's agenda. The summit did not simply acknowledge their place, it demanded it. And this validation carries powerful implications for domestic politics across the continent. Grassroots movements suddenly gained leverage. When citizens know their concerns can influence decisions at the world's highest economic forum, local officials can no longer dismiss their demands as unrealistic. Across Africa, expect rising calls for accountability, better governance, stronger transparency, and public budgets aligned with real human needs rather than foreign expectations. Socially, the effects extend even deeper. The summit highlighted gender-based violence as one of the continent's greatest wounds, a crisis that steals dignity, safety, and opportunity from millions of women and children. By placing this issue on the global stage, Africa signaled that social justice is not a side conversation. It is core to its development agenda. This shift places pressure on governments to strengthen laws, invest in shelters, build mental health systems, and confront cultural norms that have long silenced victims. Youth movements were another group profoundly affected. The acknowledgement that young Africans who form the majority of the population must help shape policy marks a radical departure from past governance models. For the first time, the continent's youth are not portrayed as beneficiaries of development, but as architects of it. With global attention on their role in innovation, AI governance, environmental justice, and economic transformation, young Africans now hold a political opening previous generations never had. On the economic front, the consequences may be even more far-reaching. Once Africa asserts ownership over its minerals, its land, its labor force, and its intellectual capital, global corporations and powerful nations must recalibrate. They can no longer depend on a fragmented, underrepresented Africa. They must negotiate with a united, intentional one. This shift could transform trade agreements, reshape debt negotiations, and give Africa the leverage it lacked for decades. And across the continent, people watching from Burkina Faso to South Africa began to connect the dots. On Africa news platforms, commentators pointed out that this G20 moment echoes the rising spirit of sovereignty championed by leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, leaders who argue that political independence means little without control over economic destiny. The summit did not simply end with applause. It triggered a new chapter one where Africa's social struggles and political aspirations are no longer separate stories, but a single rising narrative. In many American towns, the morning news still begins the same way: quiet anchors, measured voices, and images from distant continents that feel far away. But beneath that calm tone lies a growing realization: what happens in Africa no longer stays in Africa. It shapes supply chains, technology, global finance, and even the cost of goods on U.S. shelves. And when Africa stood at the G20 Social Summit and demanded to be an architect of the future rather than a subject of it, policymakers in Washington, Brussels, Beijing, and New Delhi took notice. For the United States, the message landed with particular weight. American industries, from electric vehicles to renewable energy to advanced computing, depend heavily on minerals found overwhelmingly in Africa: cobalt, manganese, rare earth elements, lithium, and more. For decades, America's strategy relied on indirect influence partnerships shaped through intermediaries and the assumption that African nations would remain politically divided and economically dependent. But the summit revealed a different Africa: assertive, unified, and unwilling to be treated as a supplier of raw materials without a seat at the decision-making table. This shift triggers three major concerns in Washington. First, supply chain security. If Africa begins negotiating as a bloc rather than as fragmented states, the United States must compete not just with China, but with Africa's own expectations for value addition, local manufacturing, and fair pricing. That means higher global standards, fewer loopholes, and a future where American companies must adjust rather than dictate. Second, geopolitical influence. For decades, soft power development loans and military cooperation were tools used to maintain alignment. But Africa's declaration at the summit suggests that loyalty will no longer be purchased through aid packages. Influence must now be earned through respect, partnership, and equitable agreements. This recalibration forces American diplomacy to adapt to a continent no longer content with symbolic friendships. Third, moral legitimacy. When Africa states openly that global institutions lack legitimacy without African participation, it indirectly challenges the post-World War II order led by the U.S. The IMF, World Bank, and WTO, all historically shaped by Washington, can no longer operate under outdated assumptions of hierarchy. The demand for reform echoes across the global South and threatens to redefine global governance in ways that dilute America's traditional dominance. Across Europe, the reaction is more anxious than surprised. The European Union understands that if Africa gains stronger negotiating power, the era of inexpensive resource flows may be ending. Combined with Europe's energy vulnerabilities and economic stagnation, Africa's new stance introduces a long-term strategic question. What happens when the continent supplying Europe's future decides to set its own rules? In Asia, particularly China and India, the summit's message is read differently. China sees both opportunity and challenge. Its vast investments in infrastructure may become more expensive as Africa pushes for more value and sovereignty. India, meanwhile, identifies with Africa's call for fairness. It is a voice New Delhi has used for years in its own struggles within global institutions. But perhaps the most striking global reaction comes from emerging economies in Latin America and Southeast Asia. They recognize in Africa's declaration an echo of their own aspirations. A multipolar world is no longer a theory; it is unfolding, reshaping alliances, and rewriting the rules of power. And through it all, Africa news commentators point out that what leaders in places like Burkina Faso and across the Sahel have been calling for economic sovereignty, fair partnerships, and dignity is now resonating on the world stage. It is no longer a regional movement. It is becoming a global realignment. As evening falls across the continent, streetlights flicker on one by one, soft yellow uneven. Children finish their homework under the glow of a single bulb. Vendors pack up their stalls. Farmers return home with tired but determined steps. These quiet moments, unnoticed by the world, are the very reason Africa stood up at the G20 Social Summit and refused to remain silent. Because behind every policy, every agreement, every headline, there is a real life, a real family, a real community waiting for justice that has been delayed for far too long. But with this bold declaration comes a warning, one the world would be wise to hear. A global order that continues to marginalize Africa will not survive the century ahead. A system that relies on African minerals, African land, African labor, and African youth, but denies African voices, cannot remain stable. The G20 summit showed us that a turning point has arrived. The old rules are cracking slowly but unmistakably, and a new chapter is being written in real time. Yet change is not guaranteed. It can still be resisted, diluted, or delayed. And that is where the deeper question lies, not for Africa alone, but for the entire world, including the United States. Are global powers ready to embrace a fairer system, or will they cling to structures that no longer reflect reality? If Africa is allowed to stand as an equal partner, the world gains a stronger foundation, more stability, more innovation, more shared prosperity. But if Africa's call for justice is ignored again, the consequences will echo far beyond the continent. Inequality will worsen, instability will grow, and trust in global institutions already fragile may collapse altogether. This is why the voices rising across Africa matter, from the halls of South Africa to the communities of the Sahel, where leaders like those in Burkina Faso argue for sovereignty, transparency, and respect. Whether you agree with every policy or not, the movement itself, the demand to be heard, is reshaping international politics before our eyes. And Africa news platforms are capturing every moment of this transformation, bringing global audiences into a conversation that can no longer be postponed. Before we close, I want to leave you with two simple but urgent questions. Do you believe Africa deserves a seat in every room where its fate is decided? And do you think leaders like Ibrahim Traoré represent the beginning of a new era or a test the world has not yet learned to face? If these questions matter to you, your voice matters too. Please share if you believe that ordinary people, not just politicians, should shape the future of our world. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. Because the story of Africa's awakening is still being written, and you deserve to witness every chapter.